Also dann, Thomas der Namalinge, Samrolia.
Begin, I would like to offer you all my greetings. I wish that you are well. Today is the 9th day of the Arya Chema Spring Dharma teachings. And so today what I'd like to speak to you about is the 7th good deed from Miki Dorje's autobiographical verses, Good Deeds. Now, according to the outline from the commentary on good deeds by the attendant Sanjay Pelder, the passage on meditation has two parts: the meditation and post-meditation, the exchanging himself in meditation and taking adversity and path in post-meditation. The second part, taking adversity as a path in post-meditation, has 10 different subtopics. And among them, the first, taking run out of supplies as the path. The second, taking harm as the path. The third, taking speech as the path. The fourth, taking pleas of words as the path. The fifth, taking suffering as the path. And the sixth, taking the benefit and happiness of good intentions as the path. Those 6 have been discussed. And so today we have come to the 7th, taking the acting upon good intentions as the path. And so the stanza for this topic, taking acting upon good intentions as the path, is to gain enlightenment to benefit oneself and others, one must leave self-disparagement, despair, anxiety, and weariness far behind, and strengthen one's unstoppable disciplines. How could I, in this life, let my practice fluctuate? I think of this as one of my good deeds. Now, I spoke about this in general the other day. But before I give the explanation of this text, the other day, I told a story about Jetsun Milarepa. I gave an example from his life story, and I thought I would like to say a bit more about this story and add a few more details. Generally, there are many liberation stories of Milarepa. There are quite a few, and among them, the most well-known is the one written by the Tsangyen Heruka. Generally, we say the life of Milarepa, everyone thinks of the one by Tsangyen Heruka. This is how it is, right? However, the oldest liberation story and one of the best sources is not necessarily the one by Tsangyen Heruka. The one that he used as his sources, and there's one about the liberation story called the 12 Great Deeds, or by the 12 Great Students. This is a liberation story prepared by 12 of his great disciples. So this is one that we must consider the most reliable, the best source on the liberation story of Milarepa. And there's also the one we call the Black Treasury. It was compiled by the third Karmapa Rangjung Dorje during his time. And so this liberation story called the Black Treasury. And so there are many different liberation stories of Milarepa, but the story that I explained the other day about what he said before Milarepa passed away, he said to his students, I don't have many important possessions to give away, but please give this black aloe wood staff and cloth hat. And there's a piece of a cloth that had been cut in pieces to the physician from Dakpo Gampopa. So he prepared a few things to send to Gampopa. And he also said, before I had told Raichungpa to arrive at here by this time, so if he comes on time, please give him these. And if he doesn't, then send it to Raichungpa. And he gave a little, he had a walking stick and a piece of cloth. And then there's also a flint and steel that Milarepa had used, flint that Milarepa had used to light fires. And he said, give this to Jigungrepa. And he had like an old hat, kind of an old, kind of a tattered Pandita hat. And he said, give that to Sabinrepa. And he had the cotton robe that he wore himself, and he said to cut it up into pieces and give a piece to each of the repas. And not only did he say this, but what he also said, I don't have anything of great value to give you. But in terms of the monetary value, there's nothing valuable here. But and I'm giving each of these things. I think that you'd bring each of you a different siddhi or power or accomplishment. So even though they are not valuable, they have a lot of blessings. And likewise, as I said the other day, he said, I have a little bit of gold, he said. A little bit of gold that I have saved up. And so he had a little retreat hut, the little hut where he practiced. And he said, in the back, he's hidden it and I've hid it in the back of all of my retreat huts. So after I've passed away, you'll take the gold and distribute the gold to all the students. And if you distribute the gold, then many people thought that someone like Miller must have a lot of gold. Usually you'd think about in terms of Vexen, has nothing at all, right? He doesn't even really have any decent clothes to wear. He didn't even have clothes that would cover his entire body. So when he says that he has gold, so everyone started got. This is something that I never thought could have happened, and many people began to like doubt. And some Milarepa at that time, so they had a student called Lexi. And what Lexi said, how could Milarepa have study like this? You can never listen to what people say. And then people say anything at all. And they just end up committing misdeeds. So this is what he said. And basically later, after Milarepa passed away, they did what he said. All the disciples got together and went to look to see where was the gold. And when they looked for the gold, they went to the place where Milarepa said he had hidden the gold and found that there was something that he'd wrapped up in cotton fabric. And when they found it, then everyone then when they immediately opened it up and looked at it, there was no gold. No, there wasn't any gold. So what was there? There were 3 pieces of white raw sugar candies. A letter from Milarepa himself, and also a piece of flint. And the flint is a kind of a special one. It's like a multi-purpose tool. It can be used as a knife. It can be used as like a spoon for when you're eating food. So you could use it as a spoon or a fork. And also, when you're something, you also need to have like a little awl or punch to make holes when you're setting. So he had that type of a flint, kind of a multi-purpose flint. And and if you are nomads, then you know what a flint is like, and you know what the raw sugar candies are like, but so that you all can know. Well, I think I've prepared some pictures for you. Okay, so the flint is like this, right? So that's what flint is like. In the past, flint was just actually something when you went for a long time. At that time, it was something you had to have when you're traveling. Later, it was not so much. It became like sort of like an ornament that people, it didn't really have any other uses. Then, like the raw sugar candy, I think the three pieces of raw sugar candy were like this. They have kind of like a hemispherical shape. And so that's what a flint is like. This is what the raw sugar candy is like, just so that you can all see. So the flint that's basically the way you usually, but the one that Milarepa had was a little bit different, right? It had many different uses. It's because when Milarepa went, when he traveled, he did a little bit tool, right, to light fires, right? And so he had one tool that worked for everything, and so he didn't have to carry a lot of things. In any case, when they opened up this fabric, they found these things, and they looked at the letter, and what it said is that cut these sugar candies with a knife, and if you cut it, then definitely there'll be enough for everyone. There'll be enough sugar candy for everyone. And there's also this square cloth, and if you cut it with a knife and you distribute it to people, until the fabric will not run out until there are no more people, he said. Now, the main point is that there are many people who said that I, Milarepa, had gold. It's quite possible people said that. And so stuff their mouths with shit, he said. And so at that point, all of the students, Milarepa had passed away, and they were really grieving and sorrowful. And at that moment, when they read the Milarepa's letter, and there's this funny joke there. And it was written that so everyone started laughing, and they began to feel a bit more lighter in their minds, and and they all laughed. And then they did as Milarepa said. And after they finished all the rituals for his passing away, then all the students and his sponsors all gathered, and they divided the sugar candies and the cloths, and it was really kind of miraculous. What was amazing about it is that, as I said before, there are these little kind of lumps of sugar candy, right? They cut the raw sugar candies. When you cut it in half with a knife, then actually the two pieces have to become smaller, right? Because each of them is only half, right? They're only half each, and so, but the amazing is when cutting the sugar candies with a knife, they didn't get smaller. Actually, two exactly the same raw sugar candies. And so when they did this, when they're typing the two of these, then after two, then there were four. Then when we cut those, and then four were cut into 8, and then the 8 were cut into 16. And then the 16 were cut into 32. In any case, it was like never ending. There's no end to the sugar. Likewise, there is just a square of cotton fabric, and when they cut that with a knife, then they tear it apart, and you tear it apart, then the fabrics didn't get, piece of fabric didn't get smaller, but each of them were like a full square of fabric. And the same, as I said before, from 2, you can make 4, from 4, you can make 8, and from 8, they made 16, as I said before. And basically, everyone who was there got a piece of the sugar candy and a piece of the fabric. Not only did they get them, when they started, they took the raw sugar candy, as they took, so it's a sugar candy that has got to be great blessings that the miller was given us. So they immediately started to eat the sugar candy, and they ate it. And no matter how long they tried to eat it, it never ran out. No matter how long they ate it, at the very end, so there's no end to this. So they'd put it in their pockets and they'd carry it home. And so the parents got it, and when they brought it inside, and they give it to all the family members, so they go to this and still didn't get any smaller. And so, in this way, it's like the place where Milarepa passed away was kind of in like the regions of both Jing and Yan'an. It was in the region of both Jing and Yan'an. So everyone at Jing and Yan'an had for a whole year, they had burum that just would never run out. They had the sugar candy that would never run out that they could eat. And so there's much the raw sugar candy. There's nothing more amazing than this raw sugar candy, they said. And so this became really famous and well known. There are many other related events with that. For example, a year after Milarepa had passed away, for the time where Milarepa is in the place, during that duration, in the area where Milarepa passed away, on all the good days and auspicious astrological days, there are always beautiful sounds, melodies coming from the sky. At that time, there weren't any recordings of, nice music to play at that time. It was like this really remote place. But they would go, there's always really beautiful sound, music coming from the sky. Likewise, there are always these rains of flowers. And when the rains of flowers, they're like the little boys and girls, the kids. And these little children, when they saw the flowers, they go run off to catch the flowers. They rushed after each other and pushed each other to get the catch the flowers. And if someone caught the flowers, they wouldn't give it to anyone. They'd run away, and then the ones who couldn't catch one would have to try to get the flower back from. And so this was also another miraculous event. And so now the reason, if we think about the reason why Milarepa would leave the sugar candies in the cloth, one thing is that actually Milarepa, he didn't have anything. He didn't have anything. He was like the most beggar of beggars. He was even poorer than beggars. He was in like the worst off position of Milarepa. When he was staying in the mountain retreats, he was worse off than most beggars. And he didn't have any resources or wealth of his own, but in the end, he had these 3 pieces of sugar candy and the piece of fabric. And this was like a gift from Milarepa to everyone who was connected, kind of like a souvenir, so that if something, a support for them to remember him in the future. He said, thinking in this way, he made these gifts. And so what this shows from one perspective is that Milarepa had a really kind character. He was always thinking about other people. He was only thinking about others. Sometimes when you think about Dharma Practitioner, think of like a really rigid person who never listens to anyone, who doesn't do anything, who's really inflexible. So that's what we think sometimes, right? Some Dharma practitioners are like that, but Milarepa was not. And in particular, I think one reason why he left these supports for souvenirs, mementos of remembering him. Basically, at the time that he passed away. What it says in the old liberation stories, what it says is that after I pass away, he said, for 7 days, just leave me alone. Don't disturb my body for 7 days and leave there. And after 7 days, I will have something to say, he said. When he said, I have something to say, then the student said, after the Milarepa passed away, then they didn't disturb his body. They didn't let people go to it, and they kept it closed off, and they waited for 7 days. And when they came to the 5th day, and some people just couldn't wait. They got impatient. I wonder what happened. They wondered what might have happened. They just couldn't wait. And they thought, we got to go take a look, they said. This is what they thought. But the disciples, others just said, no, you can't go. Milarepa gave this the command. He said, you have to wait for 7 days. Don't disturb him for 7 days, he said, right? In English, we say, don't disturb him. Don't come, he said, don't disturb me, don't come look at me. So on the 6th day, when it comes 6th day, they just couldn't wait any longer. And that we have to take a look. They said, don't go and look. And that's it. And when they went to look, the Milarepa's remains had become very tiny. Basically just this size, right? There's nothing more than that. Just like 1 cubit size. That's about how much it was. Now, at that time, many people had different visions of some saw it as a Chinese, some people saw it as like a vase. Some people have very different things. So many different visions then. In any case, after they had all these different visions, they all thought, if we leave him alone, then this is going to there won't even be any remains left. And if that happens, then we won't have any like supports for faith. We won't have any like relics or any other supports or any other remains for us to worship. And so the students and the sponsors, everyone, and they all decided to they decided to cremate the corpse, cremate the remains. But usually, what happens when you do the cremation, then there are relics and so forth. But there wasn't anything at all. There was nothing left at all. They all kind of disappeared like rainbows. There was nothing left. No, I mean, it's when you do the cremate, there is the smell of the burning flesh. There was no smell like that. It was all kind of like rainbows. There's nothing left of the remains, and there weren't any relics. And there are many stories about the Dakinis taking all these relics away, but there were no relics. There's nothing left of his remains. There wasn't anything at all left. And so they had no supports for their faith. And basically, it seems like the original Milarepa's original intention was to leave no remains at all, but to go into develop like a rainbow body or so forth. But that didn't happen. And so in the end, so for his supports for the faith, he left the sugar cubes and the fabric. And I think that's one reason why he left them. When he said that, he said, I have gold. So it's like he was actually someone who had no different on the inside or the outside. When you met him, He didn't have any attachment to sensory pleasures, and that's the type of practice he did, just as he does on the outside after he passed away. And so no matter how much you look for him, there's nothing that we could find. There wasn't any, he didn't have any wealth or possessions. But the reason why I said that he had gold, it was practice to see how much belief did his students have in him. So I think this is another reason why I must have said this. In any case, I didn't really relate the story well, so I thought I should explain it again. Now, so for the 17th of the good deeds, the way that Mikyo Dorje performed his own activity and did things, so there are things that they're called by the name of practice, study as sutra and tantra, but that in actuality, he would actually say, he actually examined these activities to see would they actually benefit him and himself others or harm them. If there was something that actually would harm this, even though by name they were called the practice study of the actions of practice study or deeds and activity, whatever name you give them, he had said that these are something we have to stop doing, something we have to give up. And so he himself stopped doing these actions and gave them up. And because he did this himself, all the students who followed him, the ones who are receptive, and followed Mikyo Dorje's example, and when there are things that looked on the outside as they should be virtuous, if they were actually unvirtuous or neutral things, and they also stopped preferring those. And he was like it's a good condition that helped them stop doing these things. Likewise, Mikyo Dorje him also said in his 100 Short Expressions, it's very clearly, what it says is, if something actually is best to benefit sentient beings directly, then that's great. If you cannot, then you should have focus on the benefit of sentient beings directly and begin by not harming sentient beings. And then if you do that, then you either teach the Dharma or contemplate and meditate and listen to the Dharma. If you gather monks and sustain monasteries, or if you build stupas and statues and so forth, then that's also fine. In any case, if you do all that you can, all your intentions and actions will become causes of achieving great enlightenment. And there's a hope that they can actually cause great enlightenment. If you do not do that, and at the beginning you begin doing the action, you do not have the thought that you're focusing on the benefiting sentient beings, or even if you have the wish to benefit sentient, but when you're performing the action, if it begins to harm sentient beings, then even if it looks like listening, contemplating, and meditating on the outside, or a gathering of merit, it looks like a good action, but in actuality, none of those actions can become causes for achieving Buddhahood. They cannot become causes, they cannot bring you to achieve the liberation and omniscience, so you need to stop doing them. So he was not attached to things that were called by the name of Dharma and virtue. It was actually what is actually real Dharma in practice, and what was natural Dharma in practice. And this is what he was really thinking about. It's what he was really most interested in. And because of this, Mikyo Dorje, when he was listening to and contemplating the sutras and tantras, while he's doing this listening, contemplation, meditation practice on these points improved. And while he was working hard at the meditation practice on their meaning, the extent of his knowledge from listening and contemplation also increased. So basically, whatever he was doing, everything that it worked together to increase his virtue, naturally working to increase the virtue. And so his listening, contemplating, and meditation each contributed to each other. It wasn't like they impeded each other in any ways. So basically, his listening, contemplating, and meditation became like one thing that worked together. Like these days, we have like shadras and the pujas separately. We have a separate monastic college for those who are studying. We have a separate puja collection for those who are doing pujas. And sometimes and so for one aspect is that when we are doing this, that when you are emphasizing in the study, in order for those who are studying to emphasize it, and those who are doing practice to emphasize on practice. And so it's in terms to basically bring up the power. It's like the function to be able to bring out a definite result. And so so that's the reason we have the different sections for study and practice. However, from another perspective, another reason why the reasons why we separate the sections of study, it's like those who are doing the study are unable to do practice, and those who are doing practice are unable to do studies. It's like, and so one person can't do both well. So at the end, there's nothing to do but to kind of separate the sections of teachings and study and practice. And so for nothing is because it's like this is like the situation it came down to. But for someone like Mikyu Dorje, at that time in Tibet, it was a very degenerate time. And the people of that time, I'm going to say they really were not very tamed in their beings. They're very difficult to tame or subdue. And so in his term, he, with great pure intentions for the ascensions of beings and teachings, he would, when he was practicing generosity, discipline, then he would also like practice generosity. And when he was practicing generosity, he was also keeping discipline, so that they both work together and they benefit each other. So it's not like when he was practicing generosity, he would forget about discipline or other. It's like they each contributed to each other. And that's why the way he did all his activity and deeds. Likewise, when he was doing the practice of the listening, contemplation, and meditation, the practice of the three types of trainings, or when he was doing the practice of teaching or debate or something, or when he was giving the various different voices of Pratimoksha, the Bodhisattva, or giving the empowerments, or giving empowerments, giving instructions, or giving transmissions, reading transmissions. Or even when he was doing things like doing a seven branch prayers or reciting other aspirations, basically, no matter what virtuous activity he was doing, it wasn't something where he thought, oh, I can do it to do it, not today. That's not how he was. Instead, and that what he did today, what he needed to do today, he did immediately. He had the great diligence to do that. Sometimes he was never discouraged and thought, I can't do this physically or I can't do this mentally. No matter when, at all times, no matter how difficult the job they had to do, he had the thought, I can do this. And that sort of enthusiasm and that sort of confidence that he could do it. And when he was doing these activities, and he had, of course, many adversities and bad circumstances. No matter how many adversities occurred, he always accepted the hardships and he faced up to them. So he had this sort of patience to be able to do this. And he also had the equanimity that allowed him to kind of overcome the hardships. And he also made his ultimate dedications that everything he did was to bring all sentient beings to enlightenment. And And when he made the dedications, you could say that they were as these are dedications that were free of the three spheres, as you could say, or that were imbued with this realization of emptiness. And in any case, even when he was doing regular things like walking around, or when he was lying down in the evening, no matter what sort of action he was doing, it's like he was never free of the view, meditation, and conduct of the great enlightenment, no matter what activity he was done in his entire life. He made all of them become for the benefit of sentient beings, and he focused them for this for the sake of sentient beings in the teachings. That was an example that he gave. Likewise, when he said, this is an action that will benefit sentient beings, this is an action that will harm sentient beings, he said, he sort of showed people the main points of what is an action that benefits beings, what is an action that harms beings. And he directed other people on how to do this. And he, for himself, never mixed up these practice of what should be done and should not, as he did his practice. And so because he's practicing this way, no matter what action he did, like, for example, when he was doing listening and contemplating, it's like it was no meditation. It wasn't like that. Because of the power of his listening and contemplation, his meditation naturally increased. And while I was doing the meditation practice, his understanding of listening and contemplation increased. The breadth of his knowledge increased. And so they each contributed to each other. And no matter what adversity he faced, he was never like squeezed by it or harmed by it. And so all the practice things that he did, they all contributed to each other and they all were beneficial. And they all became something that would benefit other sentient beings. You could say this is his liberation, the example of his liberation, the example. And one thing that we need to understand is that Mikyo Dorje would often work a lot at night. Or he'd always do a lot of work. He'd give teachings, he was writing texts, he was writing letters, he would have conversations with other people, he would have jokes with people. Sometimes he would drink tea or eat meals. Sometimes when he would hear what people had to say about his own individual and general activities, and he'd give discussions. And in the evenings, in the morning, he'd do his own meditation and reciting prayers and so forth. There are many different things that he did. And while I was doing all this, and if you think about it, there's so many different things. We're extremely busy. It's such a busy day that if it does one, that's going to harm it. If it does another, it's going to harm it. If it does this thing, it's going to mean that he wouldn't have time to do this. He'd feel like that. But it wasn't like that. For Mikyo Dorje was able to do everything that he did, no matter what he did. Nothing that he did interfered with each other. Everything contributed to each other. You couldn't lack time because of something. It was no situation like that. And so at that time, Mikyo Dorje wrote a letter. He said, it's not just something that he wrote down. If you take a look at his writings, there are probably over 100 volumes, as his attendant, Sanjay Peldup, said. So Sanjay Peldup was an attendant who was with him all the time. He wrote had a lot of writings. In any case, Mikyo Dorje was really diligent in his work, and he had a really very vast view for the teachings of sentient beings, and he worked night and day to benefit them. And so this is something we need to recognize. And so we will now take our break for 30 minutes. As I was explaining before, Lord Mikyo Dorje would do many different types of activities at the same time, or when he was doing listening, contemplation, meditation, one would not prevent him from doing the other. Starting one would not prevent the other. There are many such situations, and because of this situation, Mikyo Judai, what he said about in his own song, he wrote these words. If you look from outside, there's nothing I do not do. If you look from inside, I'm free of doing anything. If you ponder it, it's not the object of mind. Who can fathom the nature of Yangshin Sarma? So the main point of this is, if you look at the external appearance, Mikyo Dorje would do anything. There's nothing that he wouldn't do. He did anything at all. But if you look from inside, if you look at the actual thing, that should mean not just the external appearance. If you examine his actual meaning of it was free of doing anything. Without any thought at all, he was able to act. And so whatever, in this way, he was free of any action. This is his realization, you could say, or the fact that he was always resting in meditative equipoise. If you pondered it, it's not the object of mind. So if you think about it in terms of the actual ultimate, then the way Mikyo Judai performed his activity is inconceivable. It is unfathomable and quite amazing. So who can fathom the nature of Yangshin Sama? So Yangshin Sama is another name for Mikyo Dorje. Mikyo Dorje had many different names. Yanching Sampo, or Mingyur Sampo, and many other such names. And so at that time, he used the name Yangshin Sarma and said, who can fathom the nature of Yangshin Sarma? So Mikyo Dorje's actual nature, or what his own intent and thought, is something that other people would not be able to understand or conceive of. Now, next, I would like to give like an introduction to the main point of this 17th good deed. And so if you take like to give it the two main points, there are two main points to summarize this good deed. And the first of these is that practice is a 24-hour job. That's the first thing that we need to think about. And the other thing is that we must be able to combine various different types of practice. So these are the two main points. And so the first is that practice is a 24-hour job. Now, when you talk about practice, the main point of this first point is that practicing Dharma is something we need to do 24 hours a day, both day and night. At any time, we need to use our mindfulness, awareness, and carefulness. That's the point. So what we need to first understand is, the first thing we need to understand is, how should we understand Dharma practice? So practice, if we talk about it easily, it's like a system of training our mind, or familiarizing or habituating our mind. It's like a system for making your mind familiar, habituated to something. So when you're practicing, what are you practicing? It's a changing our action of body and speech, exchanging our actions of body, speech, and training our mind. We have to correct and edit our mind. That's what we mean. And so when we are giving our mind training or when we're habituating it to something, only doing it one time isn't enough. It won't change anything. You have to do it repeatedly, over and over again. You have to train over and over again. Only then can you actually affect any change. The main point about needing to continually train our mind or repeatedly train our mind, so you have to think about it actually. If we need to check our mind, like if you have days, like in every year, there are 365 days. And if you think about every day, it has 24 hours. If you think about day and night, the 24 hours. And during that whole time, the mind never stops, never takes a rest. It's always working. And so for that reason, while our mind is working, if there's no way we can let go of the work of changing our mind, there's no time to rest. And so just as the mind has it works 365, so our practice has to be 365. Since the mind works for 24 hours, we need to train our mind for the 24 hours. We have to train in those 24 hours. So the main point is we need to change our life into practice and then make our practice into our life. So we have to make the practice into our human life, and then we need to make our human life into our practice. So in order to understand this, we need to have an analogy. So if you get a little fat, you get really fat, and the doctor says you have to lose weight or it's not good. And so in order to lose weight, then you need to work to lose weight. We need to put effort into it. And in order to lose weight, we need to train our bodies. And so in order to train our body, then we need to go to a place where you can train your body, a gym. And then you need to exercise. You need to put a lot of effort into exercise, lifting weights or do all these various things, right? There are many different types of exercise, right? You need to do those. You need to put a lot of effort into them. And not only do you have to put a lot of effort into them, with every day, whenever you have time, and when you have the time to do it, then you need to walk around. You need to move. You need to move as much as you can. You need to walk around as much as you can. For example, like 10,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 steps in a day. And also, you need to limit your food. You have to. You can't just eat anything at all. You have to control your food. If we don't do that, and we go to the gym for an hour each day, and then for an hour we do work hard at exercise, like as hard as we can, and then and all the rest of the time we just sit on, we just lie on our bed or sit on a chair without moving at all. It's not okay. And if in addition, then we eat a really fatty food and sit there like that, the incredible work that you do for an hour, the gym is like no benefit because you're never going to lose weight. And if you're not going to lose weight, then you won't become healthy, right? So practice is similar to that. When you say if you're going to practice and make people think like, oh, you're going to have to sit on a square cushion and spend a few hours of meditation practice, right? Some people can't even sit. Some people can't even do an hour or two of meditation practice. And so when you've gotten up from that cushion, then you lose all the feeling of the practice. When you've lost it, then it's like you've closed the book on practice. You've closed your practice. And practicing like that is sort of like a job that we're doing because it's like our ordinary job. It's like an obligation. That's like something we're doing for a job. It's not like actual practice. When you're saying practice what we need, what we need to do is for practice to fully involve our entire body, speech, and mind, and to be able to bring all of the powers of body, speech, and mind to bear on the practice. And we need to be excited about practice. You have to have excited enthusiasm for it. You have to have enthusiasm for practice. Similarly, you have to have an aim for doing your Dharma practice. And you have to have the thought, I absolutely have to reach this aim. You have to have that impetus. Nice, you have to have like you have to have a really strong desire that I have to quickly accomplish this aim or the reason why I'm doing the practice. So I'm going to give another example. And this example is that these days there's a tradition. And so Nicola Rinpoche said, and you make a resolution at New Year's. You say, I've got a new aim, I've got a new thing that I'm going to do this year. And you think about that and you make a New Year's resolution saying, I'm going to do this. This is my aim for the year, you think. So you make a new plan for the new year. Like, for example, if you make an example, it's if you say, I'm not going to tell any lies, and you make that your resolution or your plan for the year. Then within that year, all the time, at any time during that, you also need to remind yourself of that at the time. Because you have to remember, you have to remind yourself, I made this resolution, right? You need to make that, remind yourself. And you also have to encourage yourself over and over again to keep that resolution. And so when you have that intention, I'm not going to tell any lies. It has to be there, it has to be present all the time. Like if you're going out to have a cup of tea with a friend, if you're talking about various things, if you go to a company where you work, if you go to the office and you're speaking with the bosses and having a meeting, or even when you're going to a store, and you're going to buy a store like a supermarket to buy some food or something, you're buying the thing. Sometimes the people who are the cashiers, if they don't total everything properly, say, oh, you didn't count that item if they miss something. You need to tell them, right? So in brief, whether we're doing our jobs or when we're relaxing, we always have to remind ourselves of that aim or that resolution. We have to always remember it. Similarly to that, when we practice, we absolutely must, as I said before, just like when you have like a New Year's resolution, even if you make a new resolution, you have the thought that I'm going to make this, you think in this way, right? Likewise, when you're doing Dharma practice, you have that way of thinking and that sort of feeling. The resolution I gave is just like one sort of resolution, one aim. But when it's saying practicing the Dharma, it's not that easy. Just saying, I'm not going to tell any lies. It's not something we're just not telling lies. It's not going to. Dharma practice is much more complicated. It's much vaster than that. You have to do many more different things than that. And so for that reason, when we practice the Dharma, we need to have listening, contemplation, meditation complete and without them being separated from each other. Without that, there's no way we can do practice. So the main point, as I said before, is that when we are doing our practice, while we're practicing, the practitioner themselves has to have a special way of thinking and a special attitude and a special feeling. If you have like no feeling and no idea about it, and no enthusiasm or excitement about practice, if you never think about practice, if you have absolutely no feeling about practice, there's no way you can actually practice the Dharma. So what is the attitude you have to have? It's the idea of, I need to improve myself. We need to think of improving ourselves, making ourselves better people. That's the thought we need to have. And so improving ourselves, making oneself better, and thinking, I'm going to work at this. I'm going to do all I can to improve myself and make movements. So we have to have that sort of thought in our minds all the time. When we talk, what do we mean when we say improving ourselves, making ourselves better? It doesn't mean like improving our knowledge or improving our skills. It doesn't mean that. When we're talking about improving yourself and making yourself a better person means making your mind, bringing your mind to be closer to the Dharma. And likewise, you have to practice continuously. We have a particular term. So it's like the flow of a river. So it's like the current of a river never ceases, right? So when there's no point where the first water's gone by and the later water hasn't come. There's nothing like that. It has to continue to go. It's like water. So just as the earlier water goes by, the later water then flows. So we need to practice similarly with continuous effort, just like water flowing downhill. So what we need to do, what we need in order for that is that the successive days need to be improved day by day. We need to improve month by month. We need to improve year by year. That's what we need to try to do. And if we are able to do that, then we can actually become someone different than we were before. The person from last week, there can be a difference between the person from last week and the person from the next week. There's a difference between ourselves from last year and next year. There's a change in the way we think. This happens, right? Now, but when we talk about working hard, the difficulty we have is that no matter who you are, sometimes you get a little bit bored and lethargic. You just get bored and think, I got to rest. Maybe I need to relax a bit and play a game or have some fun. Anyone thinks that, right? Because we get tired, right? So when we're doing the practice, sometimes you're working really hard, and when you're exhausted, it's important that we do actually rest a little bit in those times. And it's okay to rest in those times. And it's necessary to do so. It's important. But when you're saying resting, well, nothing, we need to be careful about it. If we aren't careful about it, then that rest can actually become, great, really strong, lazy habits. So when we're practicing hard, it's important that we always remind our mind, and it's important that we keep that attitude, no matter when. They have to have that thought, I'm a Dharma practitioner. You should never forget the thought, I'm a Dharma practitioner. And there's the ways that the things that a Dharma practitioner should do and that they should not do. And you should always remember these and think, oh, this is something I should do, this should I not do? And you should be able to make sure that your mind understands. And you need someone to remind you of them, to teach you them. And so for that reason, in many of the Buddha said, what the Buddha said in many speeches, that we need to have carefulness and mindfulness and awareness. It's like you have to have a guard or a watchman checking your mind. So it's not There's not saying that someone else is going to tend to. You have to have your own self. You have to watch over yourself. So for one perspective, even when we are resting, we cannot stop practicing. In any case, while we are resting, you were just relaxing a bit, but if we just, completely stop practicing their minds, that we have absolutely no thought of the Dharma, that's not what we should do. So when we look at the liberation stories of the great beings, the great masters of the past, in the daytime, of course, they practice, and even while they're sleeping, they would continue practicing. They were able to do this. So even with sleep, you can divide it into virtuous and unvirtuous, right? And so for this reason, no matter what, you have to have this carefulness, mindfulness, and awareness. And if you have these, then even when you're falling asleep, you'll be able to continue doing virtuous practice. And so for that reason, if we're talking about in terms of being a Dharma practitioner, we always have to have this watchman over our mind. You have to have the watchman that's looking to see what's happening. Someone has to be looking to see what's going on. And you have to have someone who's kind of taking the responsibility. They have to have the thought that you're taking responsibility. And so you have the responsible person and and what the responsibility is that since we're practicing the Dharma, we need to recognize what are virtues that we need to do and the misdeeds that we need to avoid. We need to recognize what is a self-interest and what is altruism. And we need to then be able to do what we should do and not avoid what we should not do. And we should always take interest in this or pay attention to this. And so this is our responsibility. And so if we have that kind of way of thinking, then whether we're eating or lying down, or they're chatting with WeChat, or if we're looking at a post on Facebook, we need to be able to think like this. We have to have that responsibility in our mind. If we're sending pictures to someone else, or when you're sending them videos or messages, or when you're speaking with other people, at all times, you have to have that feeling. No matter whatever we're doing, whether a major job or a minor job, in our minds, so we have to have the thought, that we're practicing dharmas, and we have to have the feeling that we're taking responsibility of being a Dharma practitioner. So this is a feeling we have to have. And then when we have that, in addition to not harming others, we must also think about helping other people as much as we can, doing dharmic practices, working for harmony in Buddhism and putting effort into spreading the teachings. And so then when we have that, we can put effort into these activities, right? And then the second point. And so this is the second point that I was speaking before. The second was that we need to be able to practice all of our various different types of practice. We must be able to combine all the various different types of practice. Of course, there are many different ways of practice: listening, contemplation, meditation. There is teaching, explaining, and debating, and so forth. But you need to be able to combine them all into one. You need to be able to unify them all. This is very important. If we were to always listen to a lot of Dharma teachers and go to the teachers and listen to a lot of teachers and take one empowerment transmission after another, and eventually what's going to happen is they're going to get bored and think, oh, there's no point of that. So it's possible we'll feel like that at some point. And not only that, when you only listen to Dharma and you take empowerments and you make a long list of all the empowerments, and if all you're doing is that, it's difficult for doing that to actually improve your practice. For example, if you're thinking about education in schools, schooling and education. For example, in a school, If you take an example from the way education and what teaching is done in schools, when in a school, then the teacher teaches the lesson, right? And if the teacher only talks and the students only listen, and the students never think at all about the meaning of what's being said, and don't do anything to study or try to understand what the teacher is saying, then in the end, what happens is later the teacher will say to the student, "What did I just say? Please say again." And then the student's going to be unable to answer. And the reason is because they haven't kept it in their minds. The teacher is just always speaking, and it just looks like this noise in your ears. It's like going right through. It's going in one ear and out the other. It's like just the wind passing by here. It's just like the sound happened. I heard the words, but what he said, I didn't take into consideration. I didn't keep that in mind. And so when the Buddha says once again, what did I say? Then you have like nothing to say. Later, when you take the exams, if the question is just a little different, if they just change the question a little bit, you're going to be unable to answer. Because and the reason is you haven't taken any interest in what the teacher said and you haven't studied it. And so when the question is a little bit different, then you're unable to answer it. You don't understand the topic that you were studying. Similarly to that analogy, when we're practicing the Dharma, the Guru teaches us the Dharma. And when he's teaching us the Dharma, if we only hear with our ears and do not think about it at all, then what we say with this, we have a term for this, in particular terms. It's like teaching a parrot to recite manis. It's like a parrot, right? If you teach the parrot to recite manis, now they don't understand the meaning, and so the parrot will be able to learn how to say Om Mani Padme Hum. They'll know how to say it, but it won't be. Does the parrot understand the meaning of Om Mani Padme Hum? It's difficult. Probably won't understand. And generally, some parrots, not only do they know the words, they actually can understand it. But if you talk about Om Mani Padme Hum, it's really complicated. It's a very high level. That's something that's beyond their level of understanding. And so for that reason, it's extremely important for us to combine all our practices of listening, contemplation, and meditation. So we need to say listening, contemplation, and meditating. And then we also have the three types of prajna that come from listening, contemplation, meditation. So we've got two different things. We've got listening, contemplating, meditation, and then there's also the prajna that's born of listening, contemplating, and meditating. We have these two things. And so I think I'll speak about this in brief. I'll give a brief introduction to this. First, when you talk about listening, contemplating, and meditating, what do we mean by listening? So when the Guru is teaching the Dharma, when he's saying the words verbally, then you hear the sound in your ear, right? And you can say that hearing that in your mind is just listening, but just listening, hearing the sound, is that able to produce prajna in our minds? It can't. In order to develop the prajna born of listening, what we need is that not only do we have to hear the words that the Lama says, we also think a little bit about the meaning that we have heard, and then develop a little bit of understanding, to develop a good understanding of them. Even if we can't get a good understanding, we have to have kind of a gross understanding, general understanding up to some degree. Only when we're able to do that, then you say that you've developed the prajna of listening, because you understand something. That's when that brings the prajna. If you don't understand and aren't aware, then that's not prajna, is it? And so that's how you develop the prajna born of listening. So that's listening, and the prajna born of listening. And then there's contemplation, and the prajna born of contemplation. So contemplation means is that the understanding of what the Lama said is not just enough. If you just leave it as something you've heard, understood, it's actually very dangerous. And the reason is because I've read so many texts. I've studied so many texts. I've had so many teachings from the gurus. I think I basically understand it pretty well. And then it's a danger that you'll get proud about this. But it doesn't really help you tame your own being. And so what we need to do, we need to take whatever understanding we have gained, we then need to, on that basis, then need to continue to study and ask questions of the teacher and use both scripture and logic to investigate it. What is it like? What is it not like? We need to be able to elicit some certainty in our mind and examine what it means. And so that means that we're examining our mind. That's what we call contemplation. So that's a contemplation. And so then what's the prajna born of contemplation? So after we contemplated, then in our mind, I said, they think that, oh, the guru said something. And just as he said, and when I look at the text, I think, oh, it's really like that. And if you have that certainty, that is the prajna born of contemplation. If you have a stable certainty, if that comes, so that certainty is really important. If you develop that stable certainty, then you won't just follow what anyone else says, or you really won't follow what everyone in society says. You're going to use your own intelligence, right? If you can say, oh, if you practice in this way, you're going to have this fault. If you do practice this way, you can abandon these faults. You can develop these qualities. If you don't do a practice, there's no way that you develop these qualities or pick up these faults. You have this really definite certainty, absolute certainty that you have it. And that's what we call by the certainty. If you do this, this is going to happen. If you do not do this, this is going to happen. There's a real certainty of what's going to happen. And then this is what we call the certainty. And if you develop that type of certainty, then you'll be able to develop the prajna born of contemplation. Then after that is meditation. And when you talk about meditation, you see you've developed the certainty. And then in addition to what the Lama said, you've looked at study, you've studied, you've examined it, and you think that this is really it. And so you have that sort of decisive feeling in your mind, and that decisiveness is not just something you just leave right there. You need to sit, day and night, you need to just try to bring your mind and mix your mind and the Dharma that you have. You need to see that the two become incorporated into each other, so they become unified. The Dharma you've studied into your mind, so they study it. And you need to do this over and over again. Just making effort once, just trying a Chingdalan will not be able to combine your mind and Dharma. If you need to do it over and over again, and as you do this repeatedly, as you continue to do it, so then you'll be able to do it. So doing this over and over again is meditation. So he says it's not meditation, it's habituation. Maybe I think of meditation as thinking about something, but that's not it. Meditation is actually habituation. Now with meditation, we have two types, analytic and rest-sitting meditation. There's a way of meditating where you analyze things and then directing your mind, and then directing your mind, or focusing your mind one-pointedly on this. Now, I don't need to speak about the difference between analytic and rest meditation today. But in any case, the meditation born of meditation is that when you have when you have repeatedly tried to make your mind and the Dharma the same into one, then one day you don't really need to try too hard at it. Then naturally, your mind and your Dharma will be mixed into one. And when that happens, when the day that happens, that is what we call the prajna born of meditation. So if you think about listening, contemplating, and meditation, then you think about it. So if you think about it, when you're listening, you have to have some expectation from someone else. Like you have to expect some sort of teachings or advice from the guru, and you have to listen to them. If you don't hear them, then you're not going to be able to listen to them. So among the listening, contemplating, mission, then the first one is something you have to have some expectations for someone else. But the other two, contemplation and meditation, are things that you have to do yourself. You don't need to have to put an expectation on others. There's something you have to do your own. Whether you're able to do it or not is up to you. You don't need to wait for anyone else to do them for you. If we look at this, what we can understand is that whether our Dharma practice goes well or not, if you divide it into three parts, one part, 1/3 depends on the Lama, and 2/3 depend upon yourself. And the reason for this is that listening, whether you can listen to the Dharma depends on the Guru, but contemplating, whether you contemplate or not, or whether you meditate or not, is up to you if you did it. And so you have to, if the Lama does the meditation in place of you, it doesn't help you at all, right? So if you have these three parts of Dharma, if you divide into three parts, one part depends upon the Lama, and the other 2/3 depend upon you. And generally, when you talk about these words, listening, contemplation, meditation, they're like Dharma jargon, they're Dharma terms. But in our life, if we think about it in our life, we think about it. And so many of these situations, our daily life, we think about all the different things. If we want to learn about different things and learn how to use and become familiar with them, this practice of studying this also happens in worldly things. For an example, many people these days, whether they're in India or whether in Tibetans or many people in the Himalaya regions, what they think is, oh, there's this country, America, it's in the West, right? It's incredible. It's a huge country. It's really powerful and wealthy. It's a highly developed society. And they think, oh, if I could go there one day, then I get a lot of opportunities, they think. Oh, and I could earn a lot of money. And so there's a lot of friends and acquaintances. You hear this? First, you hear about this from a lot of friends. That's listening, right? Everyone's speaking about America, and you hear what they're saying. That's listening, right? Then all your friends and acquaintances are talking about so much about America that you get interested in it. And you think, well, what is America like? You get a little bit of interest in there and you get excited about it, and you start to get interested in going to America. And so then you read books that are about America, or you look at videos from YouTube that are related about America. Or there are a lot of American movies, right? Hollywood movies. You can watch a lot of Hollywood movies in order to get some idea in your mind of what America's like. You get a certain degree of an idea of what America's like. But when you look at books or movies about America, you know a lot about America, but are you actually able to experience what America is really like through that? It's hard to say you could. In order to really actually experience what America is like, what you have to do is you have to go to America. And then you have to live in America for a few years and work. And then if you get some experience, then only then can you understand what America's like, and that there's the actual America. Then there's also the America they've heard about from other people there, and say, you can recognize, is it the same as what you heard about, or is what you experience and what you heard about the same? And unless you go there and work and get some experience, you won't be able to recognize this. I have many acquaintances who spent decades in America, but they don't know English at all. They basically don't know any English. And they really have no contact with any of this. They just spend all their time in a house or in a Dharma center. America is merely in America, but I think that their minds haven't arrived in America yet. And when you're talking about America, they don't really have anything to say. So just your body merely being physically in America does not necessarily mean that you've had experience of what America is like. If you really actually want to actually experience, you have to go out into society and get some experience. You have to have experience just merely being in America. As it does not necessarily mean that you have familiarity with what America is. Like with America, we think that we first know that there is a country, and we hear about it and we listen about it, and we think about it, we take interest in it. Then finally, we actually go to America and we get experience. So these are exactly the same as listening, contemplating, and meditating, isn't it? But I'm not saying you should go to America. Don't make mistakes. I'm not. So you might think that I'm saying that you should all go to America, but you shouldn't understand it like that. So, for example, to another analogy is there are a lot of people who have never eaten tofu at all. Like that we make out of soy. Sometimes you can talk. If there are people, someone who's never eaten tofu, there are many Westerners never eaten tomato. So these Westerners know that there's tofu, and they sort of look at it and you talk about what it's like. I said, oh, wow, that's what it's like. Oh, that's really strange, they think. Now, if they get a little bit of interest in that, then they can go to YouTube and look at it and see what is tofu like, and actually look at it. They can see how is it made, and they can see. Then one day, they're going to go to like a Chinese restaurant and eat some tofu. And then they order some a tofu dish in order to get an experience of what tofu is like, and then only then can they actually understand what the flavor of tofu is. Not just something what someone says or what they think, but they actually have actual experience of what tofu feels. So only when they actually experience the flavor do they have the experience of what tofu is. So it's the same thing. Listening, contemplation, and meditation are different names. Basically, no matter what we do, however we get experience in life, it's all exactly the same. It's exactly the same. So basically, listening means it basically means that you've made a connection between yourself and the Dharma. That's all it means. You've just made a connection between yourself and the Dharma. Contemplation means that you need to think about it in your own head. You need to think about what is the Dharma like. If you haven't really thought about it, then it's not actually mind. You need to think about it with your head. Otherwise, it's not going to be incorporated into your mind. And the actual practice is, now in general, then of course, these are all practice. But in the very end, whether the Dharma in our mind our Dharma is incorporated into our mind depends upon our meditation. And so in our practice, we need to see if we can take the Dharma to actually instill it into our heart and gain experience of it. So we have to, it's a point, meditation is a phase when we're gaining experience. Prior to that, first is just merely hearing our ears, and the second is just sort of thinking in our head. It can't actually instill the Dharma in our hearts and on our mind. So whether we can actually instill the Dharma in our heart and mind, that means we have to meditate. That comes down to meditation. So meditation, and many people misunderstand what we say about meditation, as I said before. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to sit on a cushion and breathe in and out and relax. And just relaxing instead. That's not what we mean by. Basically, it's trying to develop the experience of incorporating the Dharma into your mind. It is the system for developing that experience. So therefore, after we've listened to them, we absolutely have to think about it. Just hearing it doesn't help. Once you've heard something, you need to contemplate the meaning of what you've heard. If you don't think about the meaning, you can listen to Dharma for eons for the rest of your life, but it's not going to benefit you. So you actually have to think about it. And after you've thought about it, then then you need to practice it. You need to gain experience. So then listening and getting experience, we need to combine them all into a single whole. When you make a single whole so that they all come together, so you have some but not the others, then that's not okay. If you do one and not the other, then there's no benefit for us. So we need to have the practice that is complete with all three of listening, contemplating, and meditation. If we practice with all three of listening, contemplation, and meditation, then we can improve our minds. And there's a hope that we become a little bit different. If we don't do that, and if we only do listening and contemplation but never do meditation, there's no benefit for our practice. Likewise, if we only do practice but we don't do, if we say our meditation but we've never done a listening contemplation, we don't know what experience or what we're doing. And so there's no way that that'll work either. Likewise, not only must our listening contemplation never be divorced, we also have the complete practice, the six transcendences. And the reason for this is because we say that we're going to achieve the state of Buddhahood, right? And what do you mean about the state of Buddhahood? It is a Buddha means someone who can benefit others without effortless and spontaneous. Someone who can, so who can benefit others without any effort at all and complete spontaneous? It's the Buddha. Bodhisattvas can only benefit others if they put effort into it. But the Buddha, because the Buddhas have the complete qualities of abandonment and realization, they're able to effortlessly and spontaneously benefit others. And if we want to come to that level, then we need to gather all the things that we need, all the perfect. So we need to work from all different aspects to come that way. If we improve in some areas, but in others, then they're not going to work out. And so because Buddhahood is like the perfection of abandonment and realization, so we need to work at this from all in all aspects, in all areas. For example, if we look at the Jataka tales, then these stories tell us many stories about practicing Genesis and being disciplined, there are Jataka stories about being patient, Jataka tales about being diligent, and Jataka tales about him practicing jhana, and Jataka tales about practicing the prajna. So we did all sorts of different practices of all the different practices. And so these are the practices, still the stories of what he did in the previous lifetimes before he became Buddha. And even in the last lifetime when he woke to Buddhahood, even when he was a Buddhahood, he did a lot of study to a very high level. And what this shows is that as he left the luxurious royal lifestyle, and then he spent off to become, for the life of a monastic living on alms, and then he practiced discipline. Then he spent 6 years practicing understandings and practicing dhyana, meditation. Then after that, he achieved meditation. And then he gave a lot of dharma generosity. He was generous with the dharma, right? Later, when you talk about when Devadatta caused him harm in various ways, he was patient with Devadatta. And so even within his lifetime, the lifetime where he woke to Buddha, he did the practices of all six paramitas. Similarly, if we look at the various incarnations of the Karmapa, they did many different types of activities in their life. For example, if you take Myakyo Dorje, for example, Myakyo Dorje himself, he only lived to the age of 48. For example, many of us, there are quite a few of us who are getting close to 40, right? If we think about this, so really actually 48 is not, it's actually very close to where we are now, right? He didn't live for that very long life. But he did many different things in his lifetime that amaze us and inspire us. It wasn't like his life was a life that we can't really have any feeling for, that was really difficult and heavy. It wasn't like that at all. For example, when we read his liberation story, when you think about only about how he listened to the Dharma from others, and you think about it, you'd think that he must have spent his entire life only listening to the Dharma, not doing anything else. And if you look at the way he wrote, It was probably every day. It was like it was probably from the sun up to sundown. He was probably sitting there writing all day long. Otherwise, someone like that, how could anyone write that much? That's the feeling we have. And also, if we look at his liberation source, he went to many different areas. He went to many remote places. And when you look at how he went to so many different places, then he couldn't have had any opportunity to do all the other things. Forget about that. All the time they spent traveling, all his time was probably used up traveling. In any case, we have no idea how much work did he do? How many audience did he have? How many meetings did he have? How many time did he spend writing? There's no way we can understand all of this in detail because it's not written down in the liberation stories. The liberation stories only tell it in kind of a general level. So if you look at the liberation story, it's 48 lines. It's like the 30 or 40 pages at most. And so like that, so don't talk about things generally. But even if we look at those general distinctions, it's just amazing. And so think about someone like Mikio Dorje. Think about how he disregarded how many hardships and obstacles to work for the sake of sentient beings and teachers. He did with the really pure, excellent teachers. He did so many activities, but he didn't thought, "Oh, I did all this. I had to do this." Like he never had any kind of like resentment or complaining about it. He was basically always going for sacrificing himself, and he didn't even really rest himself. He continued doing many different activities. And his activities was not only teaching them, he was doing listening, teaching, writing, and debate, listening, contemplative meditation. And he worked in many different areas in many different ways, doing vast things. And he had like an innumerable large and vast activities. And so this is something we need to take a look at. This is an example we need to look up to. As it said, the liberation stories of the past masters as the practice of their followers. So because of seeing the liberation stories of the base, then we get a little bit of courage for ourselves. And then we go, how can we open up our minds a bit? We say, oh, the past masters went through this many hardship for us, and they sacrificed this much for us. And if we let that go to waste, then it's like a really, really disappointing. So when we're reading the life stories, essentially, if we need to try to do it, we can to open our mind. We can't just be always kind of like closed down and limited. We need to have a broader way of looking at things. We need to see what we can to make our intentions even more pure. We need to try to come up with new ideas and think. What we need to think about is that how we can do even more than we've already been doing for the teachings of sentient beings. How can we do even better? So in the past phase, when you talk about it, really, we haven't really used our body speech, and we haven't even looked at our levels. We haven't really looked to see, are we able to do something or not? We haven't even begun to look at that. So at the very beginning, we at least need to, should I see what we're like? So as not to waste the kindness and the efforts of all of the great masters of the past. And so I think striving for this is really important. So I think it's probably better to leave it there for today. So now we'll have the dedication prayers.